A pregnant woman lies helpless in her hospital bed, ordered not to move, not to stress, not to do anything that might harm her unborn child. Her husband knows this. His mistress knows this too, and they use it against her. What happens next will make your blood boil. A belt, a locked door, a husband who watches and does nothing to stop it. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated who her father really is. If you have ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel crazy for telling the truth, this story is for you. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from, hit that subscribe button, and stay with me until the very end. The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine Medical Center hummed softly above Caroline Whitmore as she lay in the private maternity suite, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant, 12 weeks until her due date, and now confined to this sterile white room with its pale blue curtains and the constant beeping of the fetal heart monitor beside her bed. She had been admitted 3 days ago after collapsing in the penthouse kitchen. The diagnosis had come swiftly and terrifyingly from Dr. Robert Matthews, a silver-haired obstetrician with kind eyes and a grave voice. Threatened preterm labor caused by prolonged psychological stress, absolute bed rest, continuous monitoring, no unnecessary movement, no emotional agitation. Caroline closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time she had felt truly calm. It seemed like another lifetime, before Garrett had started coming home at midnight smelling of unfamiliar perfume. Before her phone calls to friends began going unanswered because he had quietly convinced everyone she needed space. Before she had become a prisoner in her own marriage without even realizing the bars had been constructed around her. The door opened, and Caroline's heart lifted briefly at the sight of her husband. Garrett Whitmore stood in the doorway wearing his charcoal gray suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass. He carried a bouquet of white roses that probably cost more than most people's grocery bills for a month. For the benefit of the nurse adjusting Caroline's IV drip, Garrett transformed into the devoted husband. He crossed to the bed and took Caroline's hand, his grip firm, but not warm. "These are beautiful," Caroline said, looking at the flowers. "Thank you." Garrett nodded at the nurse. "How is she doing?" The nurse smiled. "Blood pressure is a little elevated, but the baby's heartbeat is strong. She just needs rest and calm. No stress." "Of course," Garrett said smoothly. "That is exactly what she will get." The nurse finished her work and left the room, closing the door behind her. The moment the latch clicked, Garrett released Caroline's hand as if it had burned him. He set the roses on the side table without ceremony. 7 more weeks, he said flatly. That is all you had to manage. 7 weeks of not falling apart. Instead, you are here, making me rearrange my entire schedule, making me look neglectful in front of my colleagues. Carolyn felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach. The doctor said it was stress-related. Maybe if you came home more than twice a week. Maybe if you actually talked to me instead of treating me like furniture. Garrett's smile did not reach his eyes. Rest, that is what they said. Is it not rest and stay calm? Perhaps you should focus on that instead of making accusations. He checked his watch, a gesture Caroline had come to hate. It meant she was being dismissed. I have a dinner meeting, he continued. I will check on you tomorrow. Garrett. Caroline reached for him, hating the desperation in her own voice. Please, I am scared. Something is wrong, not just with the pregnancy, with us, with everything. He paused at the door and looked back at her. His expression was unreadable, a mask he had perfected over years of boardroom negotiations and calculated deceptions. The only thing wrong, he said quietly, is that you cannot seem to control yourself. Get some sleep. Carolyn. The door closed behind him, and Caroline was alone again with the beeping monitor and the weight of her own isolation. She stared at the ceiling for a longer time, counting the tiles, trying to breathe through the tightness in her chest. The baby moved inside her, a flutter of life that reminded her why she had to hold on, why she had to survive whatever was happening to her marriage. Her phone sat on the bedside table. She had not called anyone in weeks. Garrett always seemed to know when she reached out to friends, and his disappointment afterward made it easier to simply stop trying. Her father, Edward Mercer, was the last person she had cut off. Garrett had insisted. He had said Edward was too controlling, too intense, too involved in their lives. Looking back now, Carolyn wondered if that had been the point all along. She picked up the phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a name she had not called in over a year. Diana Prescott, her best friend from law school. The one person Garrett had not been able to completely erase from her life, though not for lack of trying. Caroline's thumb hovered over the call button. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway, and some instinct made her put the phone face down on the blanket. The door opened again. This time, it was not Garrett. A woman stepped into the room. She was younger than Caroline, perhaps 29 or 30, with blonde hair that fell in perfect waves past her shoulders. Her dress was deep red, fitted, expensive. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor as she closed the door behind her and stood there, studying Caroline with eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. Caroline recognized her immediately. She had seen that face in photographs on Garrett's phone, photographs he had claimed were work-related. She had smelled that perfume on his collar, the same scent that now filled the hospital room like a poisonous cloud. "You must be Vanessa," Caroline said quietly. Vanessa Cole smiled, and it was like watching a snake bare its fangs. "So he told you about me. I wondered if he had the courage. He did not have to tell me." Caroline's voice was steadier than she felt. "I have known for months. I just did not want to believe it." Vanessa walked closer to the bed, her movements unhurried and confident. She stopped at the foot, looking down at Caroline with undisguised contempt. "I came to introduce myself properly," Vanessa said, "since we are going to be in each other's lives for quite some time. You see, I am not going anywhere. And once that baby is born, you will be—" Caroline felt her heart rate spike. The monitor beside her responded with faster beeps, betraying her fear. "Get out of my room," she said. Vanessa laughed softly. "Or what you will call security. Tell them your husband's assistant came to bring you flowers." She gestured at the white roses Garrett had left. "I picked those out. By the way, he cannot be bothered with details like that." The cruelty of it hit Caroline like a physical blow. Every gesture of affection, every small kindness, had been orchestrated by this woman. Her husband had not even cared enough to choose his own apology. Vanessa leaned closer, lowering her voice. "He told me about you. The difficult wife, the one who cries and makes scenes, the one who cannot handle the pressure of being married to a successful man. I want you to know something, Carolyn. I am going to be in his life long after you have served your purpose. The question is whether you make this easy or hard." Caroline tried to reach for the call button mounted on the bed rail, but Vanessa was faster. She knocked it aside, sending it swinging out of reach on its cord. The fetal monitor beeped faster now, tracking Caroline's rising panic. Vanessa straightened and smoothed her dress, satisfied. "Think about what I said. For the baby's sake, if nothing else." She turned and walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "Stress is so dangerous during pregnancy," Vanessa said sweetly. "I do hope you manage to stay calm." The door closed behind her, and Caroline was left shaking in her hospital bed, the monitor screaming her terror into the empty room. Caroline did not sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Vanessa's cold smile. Every distant footstep in the hallway made her flinch, convinced the door would open again and bring fresh horror into her room. By morning, her blood pressure had climbed to dangerous levels. Dr. Matthews stood at her bedside with a frown creasing his forehead as he reviewed her charts. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "these numbers concern me. Did something happen last night to upset you?" Caroline opened her mouth to tell him everything. About Vanessa, about the threats, about the slow dissolution of everything she had believed her marriage to be. But then she thought about Garrett, about his connections to the hospital board, about how easily he could twist any accusation into proof of her instability. She had seen him do it before, turning colleagues against rivals with nothing more than well-placed words and concerned expressions. "Just bad dreams," Caroline said finally. "I am having trouble adjusting to being here." Dr. Matthews nodded sympathetically. "That is understandable. I am going to increase your monitoring and have the nurses check on you more frequently. We need to keep you calm for the baby's sake." After he left, Carolyn lay staring at the ceiling again. She felt trapped in a way that had nothing to do with the bed rest orders. Every path forward seemed blocked. If she accused Vanessa of threatening her, Garrett would deny it. If she tried to leave him, she had nowhere to go and no resources of her own. He had made sure of that over the years, slowly convincing her to give up her law career, to let him handle the finances, to trust him with every aspect of their lives. The phone on her bedside table buzzed. Caroline picked it up and saw a text from Garrett. Heard you had a rough night. Try to get some rest. I will stop by this evening. She stared at the message, searching for any hint of genuine concern. There was none. It read like a memo to an employee, not a message to a wife. Caroline made a decision. She navigated to her contacts and found Diana Prescott's number. Her thumb hesitated over the call button for only a moment before she pressed it. The phone rang 3 times before Diana answered. Diana's voice was sharp with surprise. Oh my God, are you okay? I have been trying to reach you for months. Garrett kept saying you needed space, that you were dealing with the pregnancy and did not want visitors. He lied, Caroline said quietly. He has been lying about a lot of things. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Where are you right now, St. Catherine Medical Center? Maternity wing? Diana, I need help. I need you to look into someone for me. Vanessa Cole. She works at Garrett's company. Diana's voice shifted into the focused tone Caroline remembered from their law school days, when they had pulled all-nighters preparing case together. Tell me everything. So Caroline did. She spoke in whispers, glancing at the door every few seconds, pouring out the story of her crumbling marriage, the isolation, the growing coldness, the affair she had suspected for nearly a year, and finally Vanessa's visit the night before. When she finished, Diana was silent for a long moment. Caro, Diana said finally, this is serious. You need to call your father. Caroline's chest tightened. I cannot. You know what happened. Garrett made me choose, and I chose wrong. I have not spoken to my dad in almost 2 years. Then call him now and apologize. Look, I love you, but I am a journalist, not a bodyguard. Your father spent 23 years in the FBI. If anyone can help you navigate this situation safely, it is him. I hurt him so badly when I cut him off. Caroline whispered, he probably hates me. Diana laughed, but there was no humor in it. Edward Mercer does not know how to hate you. He spent 2 decades protecting strangers from dangerous people. You think he would not move heaven and earth to protect his own daughter? Caroline did not respond. The guilt she felt about her father was a wound that had never healed, festering quietly beneath everything else. Let me do some digging on Vanessa first. Diana continued. I have resources. I can pull background checks, employment history, any legal troubles. Give me 48 hours. Thank you, Caroline said. I do not know what I would do without you. You would figure it out. You were one of the best legal minds in our class before you gave it all up for that man. Do not forget who you are. Caro, you are not helpless. You never were. After the call ended, Caroline lay back against her pillows and thought about Diana's words. She had been a corporate attorney once, skilled at strategy and negotiation. Somewhere along the way, she had allowed Garrett to convince her that she was fragile, that she needed him to handle everything, that her judgment could not be trusted. Maybe Diana was right. Maybe she had forgotten who she was. That afternoon, a nurse named Ruth Brennan came in to check Caroline's vitals. She was a sturdy woman in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and an efficient manner that Caroline found comforting. Blood pressure is still elevated, Ruth said, frowning at the monitor. Are you feeling anxious about anything in particular? Caroline hesitated. The nurse's face was open and concerned. Nothing like the dismissive expressions she had received from hospital administrators over the years when reporting Garrett's subtle cruelties. There was a woman here last night, Caroline said carefully. She said she works with my husband. She was not supposed to be here, and she said some things that frightened me. Ruth's expression sharpened. What kind of things? Threats? About my marriage? About the baby? Ruth pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, her posture shifting from professional efficiency to genuine attention. Mrs. Whitmore, do you feel safe right now? The question was so direct, so unexpectedly compassionate, that Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. I do not know, she admitted. I do not know anything anymore. Ruth reached out and squeezed her hand. I am going to make a note in your chart about visitor restrictions. No one gets into this room without being on an approved list. And if that woman comes back, you press the call button immediately. Do you understand? Yes, Caroline whispered. Thank you. After Ruth left, Caroline allowed herself a moment of hope. Maybe she was not as alone as she had believed. Maybe there were still people in the world who would listen, who would help, who would not dismiss her fears as hysteria. The door opened, and Garrett walked in. He was smiling, the charming public smile he wore like armor. "I heard you had some concerns about a visitor," he said. "The nurses called me." Caroline's brief flicker of hope died instantly. "She is seeing you," she said flatly. "Vanessa? She came here last night and threatened me." Garrett sighed and sat in the chair Ruth had vacated. "Caroline, we have talked about this. Vanessa is my assistant. She was probably just checking on you as a professional courtesy. She told me she is going to be in your life long after I am gone. She told me to make things easy or hard. Does that sound like professional courtesy to you? It sounds like you are very stressed and interpreting innocent words through a lens of paranoia." Garrett's voice was patient, reasonable, the tone of a man explaining something simple to a child. "The doctors warned us about this. Stress during pregnancy can cause all kinds of psychological symptoms. I am not imagining things." Garrett stood and leaned over her bed, his face close to hers. His eyes were cold despite his gentle expression. "I am going to talk to the doctors about increasing your medication," he said softly. "You clearly need more rest. And I think we should limit your phone calls for a while. Every conversation seems to wind you up." "You cannot do that," Caroline said, fear rising in her throat. "I am your husband," he replied. "I am trying to protect you from yourself." He kissed her forehead, a gesture so performative that it made her skin crawl, and then he left. Caroline stared at the closed door, understanding with horrible clarity that she was running out of time. 2 days passed in a blur of medical checks and sleepless nights. Caroline had managed to hide her phone beneath her mattress before Garrett could confiscate it, but she was terrified of using it when anyone might walk in. Diana had texted once, late at night, working on Vanessa background, found some interesting things. "We'll call when safe. Stay strong." Caroline clung to those words like a lifeline. On the third morning, Ruth came in earlier than usual. Her face was troubled as she checked the monitors. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I wanted to let you know that your husband has updated your visitor list. He added someone named Vanessa Cole." Caroline's blood turned to ice. "He cannot do that. Technically, he is listed as your medical proxy." Ruth's voice was apologetic. "He has authority over your care decisions while you are admitted." The world seemed to tilt. Caroline gripped the bed rails, fighting down a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. "Please," she whispered, "do not let her in here. Please." Ruth hesitated, conflict visible on her face. "I will do what I can, but my hands are tied by hospital policy. If she is on the approved list and you are not conscious to refuse, I cannot stop her." After Ruth left, Carolyn lay trembling in her bed. She understood now with perfect clarity what was happening. Garrett was not just having an affair. He was systematically stripping away her autonomy, her credibility, her ability to protect herself or her child. She reached beneath her mattress and pulled out her phone. Her father's number stared back at her from the contact list. Her thumb hovered over the call button. 2 years of silence. 2 years of guilt. 2 years of wondering if he had given up on her. Before she could make the call, the door opened. Garrett walked in first, followed by Vanessa. They moved like a unit, synchronized in their purpose. Garrett closed the door and turned the lock. The click of that lock was the most terrifying sound Caroline had ever heard. "What are you doing?" Caroline demanded, her voice shaking. Vanessa smiled and reached into her oversized purse. "I told you we would talk again." She pulled out a black leather belt. Caroline recognized it immediately. It was Garrett's. She had bought it for him 3 Christmases ago, back when she still believed in their marriage. "No," Caroline said. "You cannot." Garrett crossed his arms and leaned against the wall near the door. "She is not going to do anything permanent. We just need you to understand the situation." "The situation?" Caroline stared at her husband in disbelief. "You are going to let her hurt me. I am carrying your child." Garrett's expression did not change. "That child is the only reason we are having this conversation instead of signing divorce papers. Once she is born, we can discuss custody arrangements like civilized adults. But until then, you need to cooperate." Vanessa moved closer, the belt dangling from her fingers. "Cooperation means keeping quiet about things that do not concern you. No more phone calls to old friends, no more complaining to nurses, no more making scenes that could embarrass Garrett professionally." Caroline tried to sit up, tried to reach for the call button. Pain shot through her abdomen. and she gasped, falling back against the pillows. The fetal monitor beside her began beeping faster. Vanessa noticed and smiled. You see how easy it is. Your own body works against you. Stress is so dangerous for babies at 7 months. Please, Caroline whispered, tears streaming down her face. Just leave me alone. Vanessa raised the belt. The first strike landed on Caroline's forearm with a crack that seemed to echo off the sterile walls. Caroline screamed, but Garrett was across the room in an instant. His hand clamped over her mouth. Quiet, he hissed in her ear. The more you fight, the more stressed you get. We both know what that means. The second strike hit her shoulder. The third caught her upper arm. Caroline sobbed behind Garrett's hand, her body convulsing with pain and terror. The fetal monitor shrieked, the baby's heartbeat spiking in response to the flood of stress hormones. Enough, Garrett said finally. She understands now. Vanessa lowered the belt, breathing slightly harder. Her eyes were bright with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Remember this, Vanessa said softly. If you try to fight, stress does the rest. We do not have to do anything. Your own body will handle it for us. Garrett released Caroline's mouth and stepped back, straightening his jacket. Get some rest, he said, as if nothing had happened. I will check on you tomorrow. They left together, the door clicking shut behind them. Caroline lay frozen in her bed, shaking uncontrollably. Her arms burned where the belt had struck. Her abdomen cramped with a tightness that terrified her more than the physical pain. The fetal monitor continued its frantic beeping, slowly stabilizing as the seconds ticked by. She had to do something. She could not just lie here and wait for them to come back. With trembling fingers, Caroline reached for her Apple Watch on the bedside table. She had worn it throughout the pregnancy to track her sleep and heart rate. Now she pressed the voice memo button and began speaking in a whisper. My name is Caroline Whitmore. It is October 15th at approximately 2 in the afternoon. My husband, Garrett Whitmore, and his mistress, Vanessa Cole, just assaulted me in my hospital room at St. Catherine Medical Center. I am 7 months pregnant. They used a leather belt. Garrett held his hand over my mouth to keep me from screaming. They threatened to let stress harm my baby if I report this to anyone. She paused, listening for footsteps in the hallway. I am documenting this because I do not know what else to do. I do not know if anyone will believe me, but I need a record. I need proof, and I need someone to know the truth. She saved the recording and slipped the watch beneath her pillow, her hands still shaking. Then she reached for her phone and finally made the call she should have made 2 years ago. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then her father's voice, rough and surprised. Caroline, Daddy. The word broke something inside her. I made a mistake. I need help. Please. There was a pause that lasted only a heartbeat, but felt like eternity. Tell me where you are, Edward Mercer said, and his voice was steady as steel. Edward Mercer arrived at St. Catherine Medical Center 4 hours after his daughter's phone call. He had driven through the night from his office 2 states away, stopping only once for gas and black coffee. He was 61 years old, with iron gray hair cropped close to his skull and eyes that had seen enough human cruelty to recognize its patterns instantly. 23 years in the FBI had taught him how to read situations, how to gather evidence, how to build cases that could not be dismantled. Retirement had not dulled those skills. Edward did not go directly to Caroline's room. Instead, he walked the hospital slowly, memorizing the layout. He noted the positions of security cameras, the locations of nurse stations, the patterns of foot traffic. He observed which doors had locks and which could be accessed freely. Only when he had a complete mental map of the building did he make his way to the maternity wing. Ruth Brennan was at the nurse's station when he approached. She looked up from her paperwork with professional courtesy. Can I help you, Edward Mercer? I am here to see my daughter, Caroline Whitmore. Ruth's expression shifted subtly. You are her father. She mentioned you? She called me this afternoon. Edward kept his voice calm, but his eyes were searching Ruth's face for information. I understand there have been some concerns about her care. Ruth hesitated, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. Mr. Mercer, I am not supposed to discuss patient information without authorization, but I can tell you that your daughter has been under significant stress since her admission, and I have observed some inconsistencies that concern me. What kind of inconsistencies? The kind I am documenting carefully. Ruth's voice dropped even lower. I cannot say more than that right now. But I am glad you are here. Edward nodded slowly. Thank you for looking out for her. He found Caroline's room and knocked softly before entering. The sight of his daughter lying pale and frightened in that hospital bed made his chest ache with a fury he had not felt in years. Daddy, Caroline whispered. And then she was crying, reaching for him with arms that were bruised purple and yellow beneath her hospital gown. Edward crossed to her bedside and took her hands gently, examining the marks with the practiced eye of an investigator. These are defensive wounds, he said quietly. Someone hit you with a narrow object. A belt. From the pattern. Caroline nodded, tears streaming down her face. I recorded everything on my watch. Names, dates, what they said, what they did. Pride flickered through the anger in Edward's chest. Good girl. That is exactly what you needed to do. He sat in the chair beside her bed and listened as she told him everything. The isolation, the affair, Vanessa's threats, the assault that afternoon, Garrett's involvement, the medical proxy that gave her husband control over her care. When she finished, Edward was silent for a long moment. His jaw was tight, his hands folded carefully in his lap. To anyone watching, he might have appeared calm. Caroline knew better. She recognized the cold calculation in her father's eyes, the same look he had worn when building cases against the worst criminals imaginable. Here is what is going to happen, Edward said finally. First, we change your medical proxy. I have a lawyer, Margaret Foster, who specializes in family law. She will file emergency paperwork tonight. Can you do that, Caroline asked. You are a competent adult who has not been declared mentally incapacitated. Your husband cannot legally override your decisions while you are conscious and capable. He is counting on you being too scared to challenge him. He is wrong. Edward stood and paced the room slowly, his mind working through the problem. Second, we need to preserve evidence. Your watch recording is good, but it is not enough. We need hospital records, visitor logs, security footage. I have contacts who can help with that. What about Garrett? He has connections everywhere. He sits on the hospital board, which means the hospital has a conflict of interest in investigating him. Edward's smile was grim. That actually works in our favor. It gives us grounds to involve outside authorities. Caroline felt something she had not felt in months. Hope, small and fragile, but real. I should have called you sooner, she said quietly. I should never have let him convince me to cut you off. Edward turned back to face her, and for a moment the hardened investigator was gone. In his place was simply a father who loved his daughter. You were manipulated by someone who made a career out of manipulation, he said gently. That is not your fault. What matters now is that we get you and that baby out of this situation safely. How Edward pulled out his phone and began making calls. Patience, he said, and precision. We let them think they have won. We gather evidence, and when we have enough, we bring down the whole house of cards at once. Caroline watched her father work, speaking in low tones to lawyers and former colleagues, coordinating a response to the crisis with the same efficiency he had once brought to federal investigations. She had forgotten what it felt like to have someone in her corner, someone who believed her without question and had the skills to actually help. The door opened, and Ruth entered with a tray of medication. She paused when she saw Edward, then nodded in recognition. Mr. Mercer, she said, I wanted to let you know that I have flagged some concerns in your daughter's file. The documentation is preserved. Edward looked at her with new respect. Thank you, Nurse Brennan. Your observations may be critical. Ruth glanced at Caroline and smiled softly. I told you that you were not alone. After she left, Edward turned back to his daughter. Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow, we start building a case. But tonight, I want you to know one thing. What Edward leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, the same way he had when she was a child frightened of thunderstorms. No one is ever going to hurt you like this again, he said. I promise you, for the first time in days, Caroline slept without nightmares. The next morning brought a shift in the atmosphere of St. Catherine Medical Center that only trained observers would notice. Edward Mercer had spent the night making preparations, and now those preparations began to unfold. Margaret Foster arrived at 8 in the morning, a sharp-featured woman in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in an efficient bun. She carried a leather briefcase and moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades winning impossible cases. Carolyn Whitmore. Margaret's voice was brisk but not unkind. I am Margaret Foster. Your father briefed me on the situation. I need you to sign some documents. The paperwork transferred medical proxy authority from Garrett to Edward. It established a protective order that would need to be filed with the court, but served as a legal framework in the meantime. And it documented Caroline's statement about the assault in precise legal language. This gives us standing. Margaret explained as Caroline signed the final page. If your husband tries to interfere with your care again, we have grounds for immediate legal intervention. What about criminal charges? Caroline asked. We are building toward that, Margaret said, but we need more evidence. Your recording is powerful, but a defense attorney will argue that you were stressed and confused, that you misremembered or exaggerated. We need corroboration. Edward spoke from his position near the window, where he had been watching the hallway. That is where the next phase comes in. Caroline looked between them. What next phase? We let them come back, Edward said quietly. And this time, we are ready for them. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Edward had placed a small recording device in the smoke detector during his visit the previous night, a technique he had used countless times during his FBI career. The device was legal because Caroline had given verbal consent to be recorded in her own hospital room. Ruth Brennan had agreed to delay her routine checks, creating a window during which Garrett and Vanessa could enter unobserved. The hospital's security cameras had been verified as functional, covering the hallway outside Caroline's room. All they needed was for Garrett to incriminate himself further. The wait was agonizing. Carolyn lay in her bed, trying to keep her breathing steady, trying to keep the fetal monitor from betraying her anxiety. Edward sat in a chair near the door, a newspaper open in his lap, looking for all the world like any worried father keeping vigil. Diana called around noon with updates. Vanessa Cole has a history, she reported. 2 previous employers filed harassment complaints against her. Both were settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. Guess who paid for one of those settlements? Garrett's company, Caroline said. His personal legal fund. Actually, Diana's voice was grim. She is not just his assistant, Caro. She is his attack dog. He has used her before to intimidate people who got in his way. The information settled into Caroline's understanding of the situation like the final pieces of a puzzle. This was not a passionate affair between 2 people who had fallen in love. It was a partnership of mutual benefit, a business arrangement in which she was simply an obstacle to be removed. Around 3 in the afternoon, the door opened. Garrett walked in first, his expression pleasant and unsuspecting. Vanessa followed close behind, carrying the same oversized purse she had brought before. Caroline, Garrett said, smiling, I see your father is here. How touching. Edward did not rise from his chair. He folded his newspaper calmly and met Garrett's eyes. I arrived last night. My daughter needed family support. Garrett's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I appreciate you coming, Edward, but Caroline needs rest, not visitors who might agitate her condition. I am her father. I do not agitate her. Vanessa had positioned herself near the foot of the bed, her hand resting casually on her purse. Her eyes moved between Edward and Caroline, assessing the situation. We actually came to discuss something important, Garrett continued. The doctors have expressed concerns about Caroline's mental state. Given her history of stress reactions, they are recommending a psychiatric evaluation. Carolyn felt ice spread through her veins. What? It is just a precaution, Garrett said smoothly. A few days in a more supervised environment until we are sure you are stable enough to care for a newborn. Edward stood slowly. That is not going to happen. Garrett turned to face him fully. I am her husband. I have medical authority here. Not anymore. Edward's voice was flat. Caroline signed proxy authorization to me this morning. Your authority ended about 6 hours ago. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Vanessa's hand tightened on her purse strap. Garrett's pleasant expression flickered, revealing the cold calculation beneath. That is not legal, Garrett said. She is clearly not competent to make that decision. She is competent, Edward replied, and she has legal counsel who filed the paperwork already. You can challenge it in court if you want, but until a judge rules otherwise, you have no authority over her care. Garrett stared at Edward for a long moment. Then he laughed, a sound utterly devoid of humor. You think you are clever, he said. You think you can sweep in and fix everything, but you do not know what you are dealing with. Old man, I know exactly what I am dealing with. Edward's voice was dangerous now. I have dealt with men like you my entire career. You think you are untouchable. You think your money and your connections make you invincible. They do not. Vanessa spoke for the first time, her voice sharp with contempt. This is pathetic. She waved a hand at Carolyn. She told you some sob story, and you believed her. She is unstable. Oh, Edward, she has been unstable for months. Then why did you beat her with a belt 2 days ago? Edward asked calmly. The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. That is ridiculous, Garrett said. Nobody beat anyone. The bruises on her arms say otherwise. The fetal monitoring data shows stress spikes that coincide exactly with your visits. And Caroline's recorded statement documents exactly what happened. Vanessa's face went pale. Recorded. Edward smiled thinly. You did not think she would just accept this. Did you? You thought you could terrorize a pregnant woman into silence and there would be no consequences. Garrett grabbed Vanessa's arm and pulled her toward the door. We are leaving. This conversation is over. Feel free, Edward said. But know this. Everything you have done is being documented. Every visit, every threat, every mark you have left on my daughter. And when we have enough, you will face justice. Both of you. Garrett paused at the door and then looked back at Caroline. You will regret this, he said softly. I promise you. Then they were gone. Caroline let out a shaky breath, her entire body trembling. He is going to do something, she whispered. He is not going to just let this go. I know, Edward said. That is what I am counting on. The hospital seemed to breathe easier after Garrett and Vanessa left. Ruth Brennan stopped by to check Carolyn's vitals and reported that her blood pressure was finally stabilizing. Dr. Matthews came by to review her charts and expressed cautious optimism about the baby's condition. For a few precious hours, Carolyn allowed herself to believe the worst might be over. She should have known better. At 7 in the evening, Edward stepped out to make some phone calls. He had been coordinating with Margaret Foster about accelerating the legal timeline, and there were documents that needed his signature. I will be 10 minutes, he told Caroline. The device in the smoke detector is still active. If anyone comes in, just stay calm and let them talk. The more they say, the better. Caroline nodded. She felt stronger than she had in days, bolstered by her father's presence and the knowledge that she was no longer facing this nightmare alone. She was reviewing the legal paperwork Margaret had sent to her phone when the door opened. A hospital administrator walked in, a thin-faced man in a dark suit whom Caroline had never seen before. Behind him came 2 orderlies pushing a wheelchair. Mrs. Whitmore, the administrator said briskly. I am Robert Sullivan, Assistant Director of Patient Services. We have received authorization for your transfer. Caroline sat up straighter, alarm bells ringing in her mind. Transfer where? To our psychiatric care facility. Sullivan consulted a tablet in his hand. The order was signed by your husband as medical proxy approximately 1 hour ago. That is not possible. Caroline's voice rose with panic. My husband is not my proxy anymore. I signed authorization to my father this morning. Sullivan's expression did not change. I have no record of any such change. According to our system, Garrett Whitmore remains your designated decision maker. Then your system is wrong. Caroline reached for her phone. I can show you the paperwork. Sullivan held up a hand. Mrs. Whitmore, please remain calm. Getting agitated will only make this worse. The orderlies moved toward the bed, their expressions professionally blank. One of them reached for Caroline's arm. Do not touch me. Caroline pulled away, her heart hammering. I am a competent adult. You cannot transfer me against my will. The psychiatric evaluation will determine that. Sullivan said, until then, we have an obligation to ensure your safety and the safety of your unborn child. Caroline fumbled with her phone, trying to dial her father's number. Her fingers were shaking so badly that she could barely navigate the screen. One of the orderlies gently but firmly took the phone from her hand. For your safety, he said. That is my property. You cannot take my property. It will be returned after the evaluation. Sullivan assured her. Now please, let us make this transition as smooth as possible. Carolyn screamed. It was a raw, desperate sound that she hoped would bring nurses running, would alert someone to what was happening. But the psychiatric wing was on a different floor, isolated from the maternity unit, and Sullivan had clearly timed his arrival to minimize witnesses. The orderlies lifted her from the bed and settled her into the wheelchair despite her struggles. Every movement sent pain through her bruised arms and cramping through her abdomen. "Please," she sobbed. "My baby. You are going to hurt my baby." "Your baby will receive excellent care in our facility," Sullivan said smoothly. "Better care than you can provide in your current state." They wheeled her out of the room and down the corridor. Caroline twisted in the wheelchair, searching desperately for Ruth, for Dr. Matthews, for anyone who might help. But the hallway was strangely empty, and the few staff members she saw looked away as she passed. The elevator doors closed behind them, cutting off her last view of the maternity wing. The psychiatric ward was everything Caroline had feared. Locked doors, barred windows, staff who looked at her with pity and suspicion in equal measure. Her hospital gown was exchanged for a shapeless gray smock. Her jewelry was confiscated. She was placed in a room with a narrow bed, bare walls, and a camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. "You cannot keep me here," she told the intake nurse desperately. "I have rights. I want a lawyer. Your husband has been notified." The nurse said in a tone that suggested she had heard similar protests many times before. "He will visit tomorrow to discuss your treatment plan." The door closed. The lock clicked. Carolyn sank onto the bed, shaking uncontrollably. She placed both hands over her belly, trying to calm the baby who was kicking frantically in response to her mother's terror. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry. I tried. I tried." She did not know how long she sat there before the door opened again. Edward Mercer stood in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him were Margaret Foster and two uniformed police officers. This transfer was unauthorized. Margaret was saying to someone in the hallway, "The proxy change was filed with the county clerk at 11 this morning. Every action taken against Whitmore since that filing is a violation of her civil rights." Edward crossed to Caroline and knelt beside the bed, taking her hands in his. "I am here," he said quietly. "We are getting you out." How Caroline's voice cracked. "How did they do this?" "Garrett filed the transfer order through a back channel," Edward explained. "He has connections on the hospital board. Someone pushed it through without verifying the proxy change." The police officers were arguing with hospital staff in the hallway. Margaret's voice rose above the commotion, sharp and authoritative. "This woman is 7 months pregnant and has been illegally detained. If she is not released immediately, I will file for emergency injunctive relief, and I will name every administrator involved in this travesty personally." Within 30 minutes, Caroline was being wheeled back to the maternity wing. Her phone was returned. Her jewelry was returned. Robert Sullivan was nowhere to be seen. But the damage had been done. Caroline's blood pressure had spiked dangerously high. The fetal monitor showed irregular patterns that made Dr. Matthews frown with concern. "This cannot happen again," Edward said to Ruth as Caroline was settled back into her room. "I need someone stationed outside this door at all times." "I will arrange it," Ruth said grimly. "And I am filing an incident report that will go straight to the state licensing board. What they did tonight was criminal." Caroline lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the fragile hope she had built crumbling around her. "They are never going to stop," she whispered. "No matter what we do, they are never going to stop." Edward sat beside her and took her hand. "Then we stop them first," he said. "No more waiting. No more gathering evidence. We end this now." The next morning arrived gray and cold, autumn rain streaking the hospital windows like tears. Caroline had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the orderly's hands on her arms, saw the locked door of the psychiatric ward closing, heard the click of that terrible lock. Dr. Matthews came early to check on her condition. His face was grave as he reviewed the overnight data. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "the stress levels you experienced last night had a significant impact on the baby. The heart rate has stabilized, but we are seeing some concerning patterns. I need you to understand that another incident like that could trigger premature labor." Carolyn nodded numbly. She understood. She had understood from the beginning. That was the entire point of what Garrett and Vanessa were doing. They did not need to harm her directly. They just needed to create enough stress to let her body do their work for them. Edward was speaking quietly with Margaret in the corner of the room. Their voices were too low for Caroline to hear clearly, but she caught fragments. Emergency motion. Judge Richards. Protective order. Ruth entered with breakfast, though Caroline doubted she could eat anything. The nurse's face was troubled as she set the tray on the bedside table. "There is something you should know," Ruth said softly. My mom. I overheard some staff talking this morning. Garrett Whitmore is filing a competency challenge. He is claiming that your transfer to psychiatric care proves you are unfit to make medical decisions." "Of course he is," Carolyn said bitterly. "He manufactures a crisis and then uses the crisis as evidence against me." Ruth squeezed her hand. "The nursing staff is documenting everything. What happened last night was wrong, and we will not let it be swept under the rug." After Ruth left, Edward approached Caroline's bed. His expression was determined but gentle. "I need to tell you what we are planning," he said, "and I need you to be strong, because it is going to get worse before it gets better." Caroline took a shaky breath. "Tell me." "We are filing for an emergency protective order this afternoon. Margaret has compiled all the evidence, including the hospital records, the visitor logs, the recordings, and the documentation of last night's illegal transfer. Judge Patricia Winters has agreed to hear the case on an expedited basis." "That is good news, is it not?" Edward hesitated. "There is more. Garrett knows we are moving against him. His lawyers have been working through the night preparing a counterfiling. They are going to argue that you are suffering from a psychiatric condition that makes you a danger to yourself and your unborn child. They want emergency custody of the baby the moment she is born." The words hit Caroline like a physical blow. "He wants to take my daughter. He wants leverage," Edward said grimly. "If he can establish doubt about your mental competence, he can use the baby as a bargaining chip. Either you drop the assault allegations and the protective order, or he fights for full custody." Caroline felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, coiled in her stomach like a living thing. But beneath it, something else was rising. Something harder. Something that remembered who she had been before Garrett had systematically dismantled her confidence in her identity. "No," she said quietly. Edward looked at her. No," she repeated, and her voice was stronger now. "I am not going to let him use our daughter as a weapon. I am not going to drop the charges, and I am not going to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when he will decide to destroy me. What do you want to do?" Carolyn sat up straighter in her bed, ignoring the pain that flared through her abdomen. "I want to testify. At the hearing, I want to look a judge in the eye and tell her exactly what Garrett and Vanessa did to me. I want my voice in that room." Margaret stepped forward, her expression cautious. "Caroline, you are in delicate condition. Testifying could be extremely stressful. More stressful than lying here waiting for them to come back. More stressful than having my baby taken away before I ever get to hold her." Caroline shook her head. "I was a lawyer. I know how to present a case. I know how to stay calm under pressure." "I forgot that for a while, but I am remembering now." Edward studied his daughter's face for a long moment. Then he smiled. A genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time since he had arrived at the hospital. "There she is," he said softly. "There is the girl who graduated top of her class at Columbia Law. There is the woman who won 3 impossible cases before she turned 30. I was wondering when she would show up. She never left." Carolyn said, "She was just buried under a lot of manipulation and self-doubt." Margaret nodded slowly. "Professional assessment replacing personal concern. If you are certain, we can arrange for you to attend the hearing via video link. You would not have to leave your bed, but you could still make your statement directly to the judge." "I want to be there in person." Carolyn said, "I want Garrett to see my face when I tell the truth about what he did. That could be very risky." Margaret warned, "Staying silent is riskier." Carolyn looked down at her belly, where her daughter was moving gently. "I want her to be born into a world where her mother fought for her, where her mother did not give up, no matter how hard it got." Edward reached out and took her hand. "Then that is what we will do. We will fight. Together." The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Margaret reviewed Caroline's testimony with her, helping her organize her thoughts into clear, compelling statements. Edward coordinated with security to ensure safe transport to the courthouse. Ruth arranged for portable monitoring equipment so Caroline's condition could be tracked throughout the hearing. As evening fell, Caroline lay in her bed watching the rain continue to fall outside her window. Tomorrow, everything would change. One way or another, the nightmare she had been living would reach its conclusion. She placed both hands over her belly and spoke softly to her daughter. "I do not know what kind of world you are going to be born into," she whispered. I cannot promise it will be easy or safe. But I can promise you this. I will never stop fighting for you. No matter what it costs me, you are worth everything. The baby kicked in response, a flutter of life that felt like agreement. Tomorrow, Caroline thought, tomorrow, I take my life back. The county courthouse stood imposing against the gray October sky, its stone facade worn by decades of weather and weighted with the gravity of countless decisions made within its walls. Carolyn arrived in an ambulance, transferred carefully to a wheelchair by paramedics who had been briefed on the situation. She wore a simple navy blue dress that Ruth had brought from her penthouse, retrieved by a court-appointed deputy who had accompanied Edward there. The dress concealed most of her bruises. The ones on her wrists were still visible, yellow and purple against her pale skin. "Are you ready?" Edward asked as they waited in the hallway outside Judge Winter's chambers. Caroline took a deep breath. "I have to be." The courtroom was smaller than she had expected, designed for family matters rather than criminal trials. Judge Patricia Winters sat behind an elevated bench, a silver-haired woman in her 60s whose sharp eyes missed nothing. On one side of the room, Caroline sat with Edward and Margaret. On the other, Garrett occupied a chair beside his attorney, a slick-looking man named James Mitchell who had made a career of representing wealthy men in difficult situations. Vanessa was notably absent. "Let us begin," Judge Winters said. Her voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "We are here to consider an emergency protective order filed by Caroline Whitmore against her husband, Garrett Whitmore. We are also considering a counter-motion filed by Mr. Whitmore challenging his wife's mental competency. I have reviewed the documentation submitted by both parties. I would like to hear the statements now." Margaret stood first. "Your Honor, my client is 7 months pregnant and has been subjected to physical assault, emotional abuse, and illegal detention at the hands of her husband and his associate. We have medical records documenting injuries consistent with assault. We have recordings of conversations in which Mr. Whitmore and his associate discussed their actions openly. And we have documentation of an unauthorized psychiatric transfer that violated Mrs. Whitmore's civil rights." Judge Winters nodded and turned to James Mitchell. "Your response," Mitchell stood with practiced ease. "Your Honor, my client is deeply concerned about his wife's mental state. Mrs. Whitmore has a documented history of anxiety and stress reactions that have been exacerbated by her pregnancy. The so-called assault, she alleges, was actually a wellness check conducted by hospital staff at my client's request. The psychiatric transfer was a legitimate medical intervention designed to protect both Mrs. Whitmore and her unborn child." "That is a lie," Caroline said, her voice cutting through the legal formalities. Judge Winters looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, you will have an opportunity to speak. Please allow counsel to finish." Mitchell continued, unfazed. "We have testimony from hospital administrators indicating that Mrs. Whitmore was exhibiting signs of paranoid delusion, including accusations that staff members were conspiring against her. Her father, Mr. Edward Mercer, is a former FBI agent with a history of aggressive tactics. We believe he is manipulating his daughter's emotional state for his own purposes." Caroline felt her anger rising but forced herself to stay calm. She had promised herself she would not give Garrett's lawyers ammunition by appearing unstable. "I would like to hear from Mrs. Whitmore directly." Judge Winters said, "Please approach." Caroline wheeled herself forward until she was positioned before the bench. The judge looked down at her with an expression that was impossible to read. "Mrs. Whitmore, please describe in your own words what has occurred." Caroline spoke carefully, keeping her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Your Honor, I have been married to Garrett for 6 years. For the last 2 years, he has systematically isolated me from friends and family. He convinced me to give up my law career. He took control of our finances. He made me feel like I was going crazy whenever I questioned his behavior." She paused, steadying herself. 3 weeks ago, I was admitted to St. Catherine Medical Center for threatened preterm labor caused by stress. My husband's mistress, Vanessa Cole, came to my hospital room and assaulted me with a leather belt while my husband watched. He held his hand over my mouth to keep me from screaming. They told me that stress would harm my baby and that if I reported them, they would let the stress do their work for them. James Mitchell shifted in his seat. "Your Honor, there is no evidence to support these allegations." Caroline continued as if he had not spoken. "I recorded my statement immediately after the assault using my Apple Watch. My father placed a recording device in my hospital room with my consent. which captured subsequent conversations in which my husband and his associate discussed their actions openly. Hospital staff documented my injuries and the correlation between their visits and spikes in my fetal monitoring data. Judge Winters held up a hand. I have reviewed the recordings submitted as evidence. I found them compelling. However, Marbawi Mitchell has argued that they were obtained illegally. Margaret stood. Your Honor, the recordings were made in a hospital room with the consent of the patient. Under state law, single-party consent is sufficient for audio recording. Additionally, the statements made by Mr. Whitmore and Mrs. Aco were made voluntarily and without coercion. Judge Winters was silent for a moment, reviewing documents on her bench. Then she looked directly at Garrett. Mr. Whitmore, she said, I am troubled by what I have seen and heard today. The recordings submitted by your wife are damning. The medical documentation corroborates her account, and the circumstances of her psychiatric transfer raise serious questions about abusive processors. Garrett stood, his charm on full display. Your Honor, I love my wife. I am deeply concerned about her mental health and the safety of our unborn child. Everything I have done has been motivated by a desire to protect my family. Judge Winters studied him for a long moment. Mr. Whitmore, I have been a family court judge for 18 years. I have seen many husbands express concern for their wives. Some of them meant it. Some of them were using the language of concern to mask abuse and control. I believe you fall into the latter category. Garrett's face went pale. Your Honor, I am granting the emergency protective order. Judge Winters continued. You are to have no contact with your wife, either directly or through intermediaries. You are to stay at least 500 feet from her at all times. You are to surrender your medical proxy authority immediately. What about the baby? Garrett demanded, his composure finally cracking. That is my child too. The question of custody will be addressed after the child is born. Judge Winters said, until then, Mrs. Whitmore will have sole decision-making authority regarding her medical care and the care of her unborn child. She turned to Caroline. Mrs. Whitmore, I am also referring this matter to the district attorney's office for possible criminal prosecution. What you have described constitutes assault, conspiracy, and potentially attempted fetal harm. Those are serious charges that deserve serious investigation. Caroline felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of relief. Thank you, Your Honor, she whispered. As Caroline was wheeled out of the courtroom, she passed within feet of Garrett. He stared at her with an expression she had never seen before. Hatred, pure and undisguised, no longer hidden beneath charm and manipulation. This is not over, he said quietly. Too low for anyone else to hear. Caroline met his eyes without flinching. Yes, it is. The arrest happened 2 days later, on a crisp October morning that seemed too beautiful for the ugliness it contained. Caroline watched it unfold from her hospital bed through a live news feed that Diana had set up on her laptop. Garrett Whitmore emerged from his office building in a charcoal suit, looking every inch the successful hedge fund manager. He was smiling at something on his phone, completely unaware of the unmarked cars pulling up to the curb. Detective Morrison approached him first, a plainclothes officer with a weathered face and calm demeanor. Garrett's smile faded as he saw the badge. Garrett Whitmore, Detective Morrison asked. Yes. What is this about? You are under arrest for assault in the second degree, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The handcuffs clicked shut around Garrett's wrists. Caroline watched as his face cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked almost like fear. This is ridiculous, Garrett said loudly, playing to the growing crowd of onlookers and journalists. My wife is unstable. She is making false accusations. Detective Morrison did not respond. He guided Garrett into the back of an unmarked car with practiced efficiency. The scene shifted to a different location, an upscale apartment building on the Upper East Side. Vanessa Cole was led out in handcuffs, her blonde hair disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled. She was crying, mascara streaming down her face in black rivers. I did not do anything. Vanessa sobbed. He made me. Garrett made me do everything. Carolyn turned off the laptop and sat in silence for a moment, processing what she had just witnessed. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the end of a long illness, exhausting and hollowing. Edward knocked softly and entered the room. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the hospital cafeteria. "You saw?" he asked. Carolyn nodded. "I thought I would feel different. Happier. I just feel tired." Edward sat beside her bed and handed her one of the coffees. "That is normal. You have been running on adrenaline for weeks. Now that the immediate danger is over, your body is catching up." "Is it over?" "Really? The criminal case will take months," Edward admitted. "Maybe longer. But Garrett is not getting bail. Not with the flight risk and the severity of the charges. And Vanessa is already talking to prosecutors about a plea deal in exchange for testimony against him. She said he made her do it." Edward's expression hardened. She was a willing participant in assaulting a pregnant woman. Whatever Garrett promised her, she made her own choices. She will face consequences for them. Carolyn sipped her coffee, grateful for its warmth. The baby kicked, a now familiar flutter that always made her smile despite everything. "Diana called this morning," she said. "Her story went live last night. It has been picked up by every major outlet. I saw." Edward's voice was carefully neutral. "How do you feel about that?" "I gave her permission to publish. People should know what happened. Maybe it will help someone else recognize the signs before things get as bad as they did for me." Edward reached out and took her hand. "You know this is going to change everything. Your name is public now. The details are public. There is no going back to anonymity." "I know." Carolyn looked down at her belly, where her daughter was growing stronger every day. "But I was not really living before. I was just surviving, hiding, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. At least now I am telling the truth." Ruth entered with medication and a warm smile. "Good news," she said. "Dr. Matthews reviewed your latest tests. The baby is doing beautifully. If everything continues on this trajectory, you should be able to go home in a few days." "Home," Caroline repeated. The word felt strange. The penthouse she had shared with Garrett was not home anymore. She could never return there. Edward cleared his throat. "About that, I have been making some arrangements. There is a guest cottage on my property that has been empty since I retired. 3 bedrooms, a small yard, quiet neighborhood. I thought you might want to stay there while you figure out your next steps." Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. "Daddy, you do not have to do that. I know I do not have to. I want to." Edward's voice was gruff with emotion. "I missed 2 years with you because that man convinced you I was the problem. I am not going to miss any more." Caroline squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Later that afternoon, Margaret Foster visited with updates on the legal proceedings. She was carrying a thick folder of documents that she spread across Caroline's bed. "The prosecution is building a strong case," Margaret reported. "Vanessa's testimony is damning. She has provided details about a pattern of abuse and control that goes back years. Apparently, Garrett has done this before, intimidated people who threatened his interests, used her to frighten and manipulate. I was not the first," Caroline said quietly. "It was not a question." "No." Margaret's expression was sympathetic. "But you may be the last. The evidence you gathered, combined with Vanessa's testimony, makes this case nearly airtight. His lawyers are already discussing a plea deal." "What kind of deal?" 8 to 12 years. Depending on what he admits to, he would have to plead guilty to assault and conspiracy at minimum. Caroline considered this. 8 years. It seemed both too long and too short. Too long for the man her husband had once pretended to be. Too short for the monster he had revealed himself to be. What about Vanessa? 3 years. Probably, with possibility of parole in 18 months. She is cooperating fully, which counts for something. She helped him torture me. I know. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. And she will pay for that. But the justice system is imperfect. Carolyn, sometimes we have to accept less than perfect outcomes in order to achieve any outcome at all. That evening, as the sun set and painted the hospital room in shades of gold and rose, Carolyn lay quietly with her hands on her belly. The baby was active, kicking and rolling, seemingly impatient to enter a world that her mother was working so hard to make safe. "I do not know what the future holds." Carolyn whispered to her daughter, "I cannot promise it will be easy, but I can promise you this. I will teach you to recognize the signs. I will teach you that your voice matters. I will teach you that no one has the right to make you feel small or scared or powerless. And I will love you more than anything in this world. every single day, for the rest of my life. The baby kicked once more, as if in agreement. Carolyn smiled through her tears and watched the last light fade from the sky. Ruth Eleanor Mercer Whitmore was born on a cold December morning, 3 weeks after her mother's original due date. She entered the world screaming, her tiny fists clenched and her lungs remarkably strong for someone who had endured so much stress in utero. Carolyn held her daughter for the first time and wept, not from sadness or fear, but from a joy so overwhelming that it seemed to fill every hollow space that the past months had carved inside her. "She is perfect," Carolyn whispered. "Edward, look at her. She is perfect." Edward Mercer stood beside his daughter's bed, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. He had faced down criminals and killers during his FBI career without flinching. His newborn granddaughter had reduced him to a weeping mess in seconds. "She looks like your mother," he said softly. "The same stubborn chin." Caroline traced her finger along Ruth's tiny features, memorizing every detail. "I am naming her after the nurse who believed me," she said. "Ruth Brennan. She saved our lives." Nurse Brennan herself had been present for the delivery, having specifically requested the assignment. She wiped her own eyes when she heard the baby's name. "It is an honor," Ruth said. "I just did my job. You did more than that." Carolyn looked up at her with gratitude that words could not fully express. "You saw me when no one else was looking. You documented the truth when it would have been easy to look away. I will never forget that." The recovery was slow but steady. Caroline's body healed. Her mind was a different matter. Some nights she woke gasping, convinced that Garrett was standing over her bed, that Vanessa's red heels were clicking down the hallway toward her room. Some days the sight of a leather belt in a store window was enough to send her into a spiral of panic that took hours to subside. She started therapy 2 weeks after the birth, a specialist in trauma and domestic abuse, recommended by Diana, who had covered such cases for years. The sessions were painful but necessary, excavating wounds that Caroline had buried for so long that she had forgotten they existed. "You survived something terrible," her therapist said during their third session, "and you did more than survive. You fought back. You protected yourself and your daughter. That takes extraordinary strength." "I do not feel strong," Carolyn admitted. "I feel broken. Those things are not mutually exclusive." The therapist's smile was kind. "You can be broken and strong at the same time. Healing is not about becoming unbroken. It is about learning to live fully, even with the cracks." The criminal trial concluded in March. Garrett Whitmore pleaded guilty to assault in the second degree, conspiracy to commit assault, and reckless endangerment. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in state prison, with possibility of parole after 7. Carolyn attended the sentencing hearing. She sat in the gallery with Edward on one side and Diana on the other, baby Ruth sleeping peacefully in a carrier at her feet. She watched as her husband, her abuser, the man who had systematically dismantled her life, was led away in handcuffs. Garrett looked back at her once, just before he disappeared through the courtroom doors. His expression was not angry or defiant. It was simply empty, as if everything that had made him dangerous had finally been hollowed out. Caroline did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel triumph. She felt only a quiet sense of closure, like the final page of a very long and very terrible book being turned at last. Vanessa Cole received 3 years, as Margaret had predicted. She served 18 months before being released on parole. Carolyn never saw her again. Spring arrived gradually, tentatively, as if uncertain of its welcome after such a brutal winter. Caroline moved into the guest cottage on her father's property, a cozy 3-bedroom house with a small yard perfect for a baby who was growing more curious about the world every day. She started working again, cautiously at first, consulting on cases, reviewing documents, reconnecting with the legal skills she had abandoned years ago. Diana introduced her to a nonprofit organization that provided legal services to survivors of domestic abuse. Carolyn began volunteering, then took on a part-time position, then found herself building something that felt remarkably like a career. The work was different from her corporate law days. Harder in some ways, easier in others. The clients were not wealthy executives seeking advantage in business deals. They were women like she had been, trapped in relationships that had slowly transformed from love to control to terror. They were women who needed someone to believe them, someone to fight for them, someone to remind them that their voices mattered. One afternoon, nearly a year after Ruth's birth, Carolyn sat in her small office reviewing case files when Diana called. "I have news," Diana said without preamble. "The documentary producer I mentioned a few months ago. She is ready to move forward if you are willing." Caroline set down her pen. "I thought about it, and I am willing. If it helps even one person recognize the signs, if it helps even one woman get out before things get as bad as they did for me, then it is worth whatever privacy I have to sacrifice. That is my girl." Diana's voice was warm with pride. "I will set up the meeting." That evening, Carolyn sat on the porch of her cottage, watching Ruth toddle across the grass toward her grandfather. Edward scooped the little girl up with exaggerated drama, making her shriek with laughter. Caroline smiled, feeling the weight of the past year ease just slightly from her shoulders. Her phone buzzed. A text from Diana. "Documentary team confirmed. First interview scheduled for next month. Ready to tell your story." Caroline typed her response without hesitation. "I have been ready my whole life. I just did not know it until now." She put down the phone and watched her daughter play in the fading sunlight. Ruth was fearless in the way only toddlers can be, throwing herself into every new experience with complete trust that the world would catch her. Carolyn had not been that fearless in a very long time, but watching her daughter, feeling the warmth of the evening sun, listening to her Anya's laughter mixed with Ruth's delighted squeals, she thought maybe she could learn to be not fearless in the sense of feeling no fear. That was impossible, and perhaps unwise, but fearless in the sense of acting despite the fear, of speaking the truth even when the silence would be easier, of building a life that honored the woman she had always been, buried beneath years of manipulation and self-doubt. Garrett Whitmore had tried to make her invisible. He had tried to silence her voice, control her choices, and ultimately harm her and her daughter. He had failed, not because Caroline was perfect or invincible, but because she had been willing to ask for help when she needed it, to accept protection when it was offered, and to fight like hell when fighting was the only option left. She was not the same person she had been before. The cracks were real and permanent, but she was learning, slowly and with great difficulty. That cracks were not the same as broken. That survival was not the same as weakness. That the worst chapter of her life could become the foundation for something new and good and strong. Ruth ran toward her with arms outstretched, shouting the only word she knew with absolute certainty. "Mama, Mama." Caroline caught her daughter and held her close, breathing in the sweet smell of baby shampoo and innocence. "I am here," she whispered. "I will always be here." Behind them, the sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. A new day was ending, a new life was beginning, and Caroline Whitmore, survivor and mother and warrior, was finally growing, truly home.